What happens to the circle when the young no longer sit close enough to pass the bowl of grain from hand to hand?
The fire in the longhouse had already begun to sink lower than the season required.
The woman who kept the hearth noticed it first when she reached for another log and found the stack thinner than it should have been after the morning's work.
The young man who usually split the wood had stayed longer at the riverbank, watching the water rather than returning with the load.
Across the room, the young woman who once wove the new baskets sat with her hands still, the half-finished reed resting across her knees.
No one spoke of it yet, but the evening meal took longer to prepare, and the children waited with empty bowls.
By the next morning, the imbalance had moved outward.
The man who should have walked the boundary stones with his uncle instead lingered at the edge of the pasture, where the grass had already begun to grow uneven.
The woman who once carried water to the goats now returned with half the usual number of skins.
When the uncle asked why the fence posts had not been checked, the answer was a silence that stretched across the space between them.
The goats wandered farther than they should have, and one kid was found tangled in brush that had been cleared the year before. Days passed into weeks.
The workshop where tools were sharpened stood quiet at midday. The whetstone lay dry.
The elder who once taught the young how to read the grain of wood before cutting now sat alone, his hands resting on knees that no longer carried the weight of shared labor.
When the harvest baskets were brought in, they were lighter than memory expected.
The woman who stored the grain counted the shortfall and said nothing, yet the next morning she rose earlier to walk the fields herself.
The young man who should have walked beside her remained at the river, where the sound of water covered the absence of voices. Seasons turned.
The boundary stones that marked the clan's land grew moss along their northern sides because no one passed them often enough to keep the path clear.
The children who once learned to bind sheaves by watching their elders now played at the edges of the work, their hands empty.
The woman who kept the hearth found herself banking the fire alone more nights than not.
When the first frost came, the woodpile was still short by the measure of one strong back.
The elder asked the gathered kin what would happen when the cold deepened, and the young who should have carried the load were still at the water's edge.
No one answered, yet the question remained in the air between the stones and the fire. The imbalance reached the pastures next.
The goats that had once been moved together now strayed in smaller groups.
The young woman who once called them in at dusk stayed longer at the loom, though the cloth she wove grew no wider.
The man who should have repaired the gate instead watched the sky for signs that never came.
When the elder walked the fence line alone, he found a post leaning where two hands should have righted it.
The kid that had been lost earlier was never replaced, and the milk yield dropped by the measure of one lost animal.
Years moved across the land like slow water.
The longhouse that once held the sound of many voices at the evening meal now held fewer.
The children who should have grown into the work of splitting wood and carrying water grew instead into young people who lingered at the edges of the fields.
The elder who once taught the binding of sheaves now sat with the task unfinished beside him.
The woman who kept the hearth rose each morning to a fire that required more tending than before, because the hands that should have shared the labor had not returned from the river.
The grain stores, measured each autumn, showed the same quiet shortfall season after season.
If the young continue to turn from the work that binds one household to the next, the fields will grow wild where hands once cleared them.
The tools will rest against the wall until rust claims the edge.
The elders will sit at the hearth with questions that receive no answer.
The children will inherit land that no longer remembers the rhythm of shared labor.
The circle that once held the clan together will loosen until the fire burns low and the storehouse stands half empty against the coming winter.
If the tale of the sinking fire and the loosening circle stirred recognition in your heart, then you must rise each dawn to walk the boundary stones with the elders, gather the child to the hearth so the flame does not sink, and bind the rope of shared labor once more across the paths that wind between the stones.
Your hands added to the watch-keep, the ember alive through the wind, teaching the young to carry the load before the storehouse stands half empty and the goats stray beyond the fence.
By standing in the circle with the kin, you sustain the fire that threads the generations, so the fields remain clear and the questions of the elders receive answer before the cold deepens.